In this video, we are going to talk about topic 7 and 8, which is the temporal bone and its canals and the bones of the visceral cranium. Right, so we're going to have 4 parts. The first part is going to be about the temporal bone. Right, so this is the lateral view, and you can see the temporal bone here. That's how it is located anatomically, right? Okay, so the temporal bone is 3 main parts. The squamous part, pars squamosa. The tympanic part, pars tympanica. And the petromastoid part, right? So the petromastoid part has 2 portions. The petrous portion, or the pyramid, known as pars petrosa or pars pyramis. And the mastoid portion, pars mastoidea, right? So 3 parts: squamous part, tympanic part, petromastoid part, which is 2 portions, the petrous portion, which is a pyramid, and the mastoid portion. All right. Okay, so this is the temporal bone, right? So you can see the squamous part here, the tympanic part here in green, the petromastoid part, right? But what you can see here is only the mastoid portion. The petrous part goes inside, so we can't see it for now, but I will show you in another picture, right? So usually in new-borns, these 3 parts are still not fused, but as time goes on, like for example, within the first year of life, they will fuse. So the traces of the fusion of the separate parts of the temporal bone persist throughout life in the forms of sutures and fissures. Right, so there are 3 very important fissures which you will need to remember, or which you will need to look for on the temporal bone, right? And they include the petrosquamous part, fissura petrosquamosa, the petrotympanic fissure, fissura petrotympanica, the tympanomastoid fissure, that's the fissura tympanomastoidea, right? So don't worry, you can identify these fissures by looking at the bones, right? So this fissure is between the petrous part of the temporal bone and the squamous part. This petrotympanic is between the petrous part and the tympanic part, and then tympanomastoid between the tympanic part and the mastoid portion of the petromastoid part, right? Okay, so this is the lateral view of the temporal bone, right? So you can see the fissure, the petrotympanic fissure, fissura petrotympanica here, right? So remember, I told you this one is the petrous part here, where you can see the external acoustic meatus, right? So this fissure is the fissura petrotympanica. This is the fissure between the tympanic part and the mastoid portion. It's called fissura tympanomastoidea. This tympanic part and the mastoid part, this fissura tympanomastoidea, right? So here is another fissure, fissura petrosquamosa, fissura petrosquamosa, right? So this is the inferior view. Please don't worry about the other labels. I will go through each and every label, right? So for now, in this view, you just need to look for this fissure, fissura petrosquamosa is the inferior view, right? And here again, fissura petrotympanica, right? Okay. And here there is tympanosquamous fissure, that's fissura tympanosquamosa, fissura tympanosquamosa, it's here, right? Okay, fine. All right, let's start with the squamous part, right? So I told you the 3 main parts, right? I told you the first one is the squamous part, followed by what? The tympanic part, and then the petromastoid part. The petromastoid part, which is divided into petrous portion and mastoid portion, right? So now we are starting with the squamous part, pars squamosa, right? So you can see this is the squamous part, right? This is the squamous part of the temporal bone, right? So it has two surfaces. It has the temporal surface, which is external, and then cerebral surface, which is internal, right? So this surface is fasces temporalis, right? So the most prominent thing, the first one, you need to remember the zygomatic process, of the temporal bone, right? So it articulates with the temporal process of the zygomatic bone, right? So look here, this is the zygomatic process, right? Zygomatic process of the temporal bone, and this process is the temporal process of the zygomatic bone. They form this arch, right? So this arch is formed like two-thirds. The two-thirds comes from what? Comes from the temporal bone, and then the anterior one-third, it comes from what? From the zygomatic bone. The other thing you will see is the mandibular fossa mandibularis. Here, that's how the mandible will articulate with what? With the temporal bone through the joint called the temporal mandibular joint. Right. Okay. And here, anterior to this mandibular fossa, there is tubercle, right? Tuberculum articulare, articular tubercle, right? So it's important. It prevents the mandible from dislocating anteriorly, right? So it's very important, this articular tuberculum articulare. Towards the end, there is a clear line, right? So this line is called temporal line. Right? So in skull as a whole, I'm going to show you this line, right? Just to know that it starts from around the parietal notch, right? Like more like it's a continuation of this zygomatic arch, right? So what is the zygomatic arch? Zygomatic arch is formed by articulation of the zygomatic process of the temporal bone, that's the posterior two-thirds, and the temporal process of the zygomatic bone, that's the what? That's the anterior one-third, right? This one, posterior two-thirds, tympanic bone. Okay. So I told you this line, right? The temporal line, linea temporalis. All right. So this is the cerebral surface, right? So this is the cerebral surface. So you can see the cerebral eminences, right? So these eminences are called yoga cerebralia, right? You can also see the impressions of the cerebral gyri. They are called impressiones digitate, right? You can also see the grooves of the artery, right? It's called sulci arteriosi. The second part of the temporal bone is the tympanic part, right? And it's here in green, right? Okay. So you can see the inferior view. Again. The most prominent thing on the tympanic part is the external acoustic meatus acousticus externus, right? So it goes deeper into the skull, and it enters into the posterior cranial fossa via the internal acoustic meatus. This, right? You can see a nerve coming in through this meatus, internal acoustic meatus, right? Okay. And the last part I told you is called what? The petromastoid part. It is petrous portion and mastoid portion, right? So the petrous portion is more like it's like a pyramid, right? So the first thing you need to know about the pyramid is an apex and what, and the base. Apex and the base, right? So the base of the petrous part is called basis partis petrosa, which faces it faces externally, and the apex of the petrous part, apex partis petrosa, it faces anteriorly and internally towards the sphenoid bone. All right. This petrous part, or this pyramid, has three surfaces: the anterior surface, posterior surface, and the inferior surface. It also have edges, three edges: the anterior edge, posterior edge, and the superior edge. Right. So here is the internal surface of the base of the skull. Right. So I told you the first one, the anterior surface, faces anterior. Right. Right. So it's it faces part of the anterior wall of the posterior cranial fossa. Okay. And then there is the inferior surface faces inferior. It faces downwards, right? So you can see it on the external base of the skull, right? So this indicated here is the anterior surface, right? So just for orientation, this is the anterior, this is posterior back, right? Okay, so this fossa is the anterior cranial fossa, here is the middle cranial fossa, and here is the posterior cranial fossa, right? So this indicated in this blue is the what is the anterior surface, faces anterior, and on the back is the posterior surface, faces posterior, right? So the inferior surface, you can see it on the other side, right? So let's spin it, right? So this is the inferior surface, right? So you can see the apex here, apex of the petrous part is called apex partis petrosa. You can see the faces anterior, right? This anterior surface here. They are very important things which you can see on the anterior surface of the pyramid, right? So the first one is the impression made by the trigeminal ganglion, right? It's called impressio trigemini, right? It's the impression formed by the what? The ganglion of the trigeminal nerve is here, this depression, right? Then you see very important openings, right? So the first one here is the hiatus for the greater petrosal nerve, right? Hiatus canalis nervi petrosi majoris, right? That's the hiatus for the greater petrosal nerve, right? And it continues like as a sulcus, right? This sulcus, it is almost the same name, sulcus nervi petrosi majoris, right? Hiatus on the beginning here, you can see it, and then the sulcus nervi petrosi majoris, right? Then externally you can see another one which is a little bit smaller, right? Here it's called what? The hiatus for the lesser petrosal nerve, right? Hiatus canalis nervi petrosi minoris, this, right? You can see it here. And it continues as a sulcus. Here is the sulcus for the lesser petrosal nerve, right? Sulcus nervi petrosi minoris, this one. Okay. Then there is the arcuate eminence, right? Eminentia arcuata, right? So this is found like between the what? Between the petrosquamous fissure, right? And the tegment tympani, right? Tegment tympani is more like a roof, right? So this is actually formed by the semicircular canal, particularly the superior semicircular canal in the internal ear, right? So you see it when we do the internal ear. That's the anterior surface. The most prominent things, one more time, the impression formed by the trigeminal nerve, right? Impressio trigemini, right? And you can see the hiatus for greater and lesser petrosal nerve, right? Greater the hiatus and the sulcus, lesser here the hiatus and the sulcus, and you can see the eminence arcuata, the arcuate eminence, right? That's for the anterior surface. Okay, so let's look at this side, the posterior surface, right? So on the posterior surface, you can see the opening of the internal acoustic meatus, right? Porus acousticus internus, this one. Right, this is very important because it is a lot of things which goes through it. The firstly is the facial nerve, that's cranial nerve 7. Then the next one is the auditory nerve, cranial nerve 8, and also the internal auditory arteries and veins. Right, it passes through the internal acoustic opening. Right, so if you look here, you can also see a subarcuate fossa, right? It's called fossa subarcuata, fossa subarcuata, read this one, right? And the next one is the aperture for the external aqueducts of the vestibule. The aperture for the external aqueductus of the vestibule, right, is called apertura externa aqueductus vestibuli, right here, right? So this shape is more like, if you remember the scaphoid fossa on the sphenoid bone, it looks something like this, right? Okay. On the inferior surface, there is the styloid process, is very prominent, right? And then anteriorly, you can see the stylomastoid foramen stylomastoidium, right? That's where the facial nerves comes through, right? Cranial nerve 7. You can also see here the jugular fossa jugularis, right? Fossa jugularis. So at this moment, it's more like a notch, but another notch is found in the occipital bone. So they form a foramen, right? So what goes through the jugular foramen, right? So the posterior part, you will see the internal jugular vein, and then anteromedially you will see the cranial nerves 9, that's glossopharyngeal nerve, 10, that's the vagus nerve, and 11, that's the accessory nerve, right? Okay, and here on the petrous part, you can see this opening, right? It's the opening for the carotid artery, right? And here there's an internal opening again and external opening, right? And this canal is called carotid canal, right? And I'm sure I missed one more thing, like between this opening of the carotid canal and the jugular fossa, there is a fossula petrosa. Fossula is just a small fossa, fossula petrosa, right? Labeled here. There is also a canaliculus for the mastoid. It's called a canaliculus mastoideus, right? It's found like here again inside the jugular fossa here. And the aperture of the apertura externa canaliculi cochlea, right? So it's the aperture for the what? For the cochlear canaliculi, right? Apertura externa canalicula cochlea here. Right, so those are the surfaces of the petrous part of the temporal bone. Right, now let's talk about the 3 edges of the pyramid, right, or the 3 edges of the petrous part of the temporal bone, right? So firstly, we're starting with the anterior edge of the pyramid, right? On the anterior edge, there are important things which you should be able to recognize, right? So there is this canal, right? It's called a musculotubal canal, right? Musculotubal canal is 2 things. There is a muscle and a tube, right? So first one, you have it forms like there are 2 things, right? There is semicanalis musculi tensoris tympani, right? So for the muscle is just tensor tympani, and the tube is called what? The auditory tube, right? So this canal is called what? Semicanalis tube auditive, right? The whole part is the musculotubal canal, right? So this whole thing is the musculotubal canal, right? So that's the most important thing that you find on the anterior edge of the pyramid. And secondly, you can see this opening of the internal carotid canal, right? This canal is just a carotid canal, canalis caroticus, right? So here you can see it's a wire, or you can see a, right? So this is the internal opening, and this one is the external opening. The next edge, the superior edge, right? So this is the superior edge of the pyramid, right? And there you can see a sulcus sinus petrosal superior, right? It's the groove for the superior petrosal sinus, right? Sulcus sinus petrosi superioris, right? So what passes through there is the superior petrosal venous sinus. And then the last edge, the posterior edge, right? The posterior edge, you can see this is the inferior view again. And you find this sulcus here, right? So it's called sulcus sinus petros inferioris. Sulcus sinus petros inferioris. Then the next part is the mastoid portion of the petromastoid part of the temporal bone. The mastoid portion is external surface and internal surface. This is the external view, right? So this is definitely the external surface, right? The most prominent thing is the process, the mastoid process, processus mastoideus, right? This process, that's where the sternocleidomastoid inserts there. If you look close here, there is a fissure it's a mastoid fissure, fissura mastoidea, right? And you can also see this foramen, very important, foramen mastoideum, right? So there is something cool about this part. So it contains air cells, mastoid cells, cellular mastoidea. So if you cut through, we have a view like this, right? So you can see the mastoid cells here, and here there is mastoid antrum, right? So the infection can actually spread to these mastoid cells, causing mastoiditis, spreading from where? From the middle ear, right? From the middle ear or from the tympanic cavity, right? Causing mastoiditis. All right, that's the external surface for you, right? Let's look at the internal surface, right? So this is the internal surface, right? So okay, or what's on the internal surface? Let's look. There is foramen mastoideum, right? The mastoid foramen, and there is also this sulcus sinus sigmoide, right? The groove for the sigmoid sinus, right? Okay. Then I told you different canals. So far you know them, but let's just go through the canals of the temporal bone, right? So there are three main canals, right? The first one is the carotid canal, canalis caroticus. Is the largest canal which transmits the internal carotid artery. It begins at the external carotid opening, foramen caroticum externum, on the inferior surface of the pyramid. The canal ascends and then bends anteriorly at a right angle and opens its internal carotid opening, that's the foramen caroticum internum, at the apex of the pyramid, medial to the musculotubal canal, right? So here is the carotid canal, right? So this is the external foramen, and here is the internal foramen, right? It's medial to the musculotubal canal. You can see it even this side here. You can see the carotid canal, the internal opening of internal foramen and external, right? And it's medial to the musculotubal canal. Where the hell is the musculotubal canal? It's here. I told you here, that's where it is. It's musculotubal, muscle is the tensor tympani, the tuba auditiva, the auditory tube, right? Okay, right. So that's the carotid canal for you, right? Then the next canal is the canal for the facial nerve, canalis facialis, right? So this canal begins in the depth of the internal acoustic meatus, meatus acousticus internus. It passes at first horizontally forward and laterally to the hiatus of the greater petrosal nerve. That's the hiatus canalis nervi petros majoris, which is located on the anterior surface of the pyramid. Please tell me you remember this, because we went through this already. Then the canal bends at the right angle laterally and backwards to form the geniculum of the facial nerve, that's the geniculum canalis facialis. It then passes still horizontally backwards and then bends again, ascending vertically, right? So, okay, I will show you this whole thing. The canal ends at the stylomastoid foramen, right? Do you remember where the stylomastoid foramen is located? Yeah, between the styloid process and the mastoid process, right? That's where it ends, right? On the inferior surface of the pyramid of the temporal bone. Okay, so you can see here the facial canal, right, carrying the facial nerve, right? That's here you can see the internal acoustic meatus, right? That's where how it leaves the skull here. I mean, entering the temporal bone, and until the stylomastoid foramen. The last canal is the musculotubal canal. I told you about this. Canalis musculotubarius. It leads into the tympanic cavity, right? It's divided into two parts: the canal for the tensor tympani muscle, semicanalis musculotensoris tympani. It is a superior and smaller part which lodges the tensor tympani muscle. The canal for the auditory tube, semicanalis tuba auditive, is the lower and larger part which forms the bony part of the auditory tube for the conduction of air from the pharynx to the tympanic cavity, right? So now you need to know that this tube, this auditory tube, has two parts, right? The bony part and the cartilaginous part, right? So the bony part definitely formed by the temporal bone. This is the musculotubal canal, right? It has been opened, right? So this is, you can actually close it there, right? So you can see the pharyngeal opening of the auditory tube, right? So you can see it here, and it goes here. And then for the muscle, you can see the musculus tensor tympani, and you can see it is small, of course, right? Just for orientation, if you remember the artery, the internal carotid artery. Okay, that's everything you need to know about the temporal bone, right? So now you will need to go to school and have the temporal bone itself and look for all these different parts, fissures, foramens, etc., right? You understand, right? So that's the first part of topic 7 and 8, right? The second part actually is bones of the visceral cranium, right? And bones of the visceral cranium, they are about 9, right? They include the maxilla, the palatine bone, the inferior nasal concha, the nasal bones, the lacrimal bones, zygomatic bones, the vomer, the mandible, and the hyoid bone, right? So there are a lot. We cannot put all of them in one video, right? So I would like to divide them into three groups, right? So this video is the first part. The second part will be maxilla, palatine, and the inferior nasal concha. The third part will be the nasal bone, the lacrimal bone, and the zygomatic. And the last part will cover the vomer, the mandible, and the hyoid bone. Thank you so much. If you like this video, please make sure you subscribe and give it a thumbs up and click the notification bell to make sure that you receive a notification whenever I upload a new video. Until next time.